Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Keepsake. If you like the show, please remember to subscribe for future episodes. Also, help more people find us by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to tell your friends about the show. Welcome to Keepsake, a podcast exploring history in the world around us, taking ordinary objects and telling the fascinating stories that they hold. I'm your host, Corey Greiner. This week's item: a straw. It started with a bang on the night of August 21st, 1986. And then over the course of the next 12 hours or so, nearly all life within a 16-mile radius of Lake Nyos in Cameroon was dead. In the three villages nearest the lake, Nyos, Cha, and Saboom, the bodies of people were found lifeless but otherwise unharmed. Some were outside or even on their own doorstep, but many were inside, some still in bed. They'd gone to sleep and never woke up. Men, women, and children perished, but so too did the animals. Whole herds of livestock lay dead in their fields. Cows, goats, and pigs, all dead. But a few chickens survived for some reason. When all was told, over 1,700 people lost their lives in the event, and over 3,000 livestock animals, not to mention the natural wildlife. A farmer who lived on a hill above the lake described the eerie, unnatural silence that morning when he ventured down to the water's shore. No birds singing or insects buzzing. There were no flies on the dead that day, he said. The flies were dead too. It didn't make any sense. What could have caused such a catastrophe? Who or what was responsible? Reports from the few survivors started to fill in some of the gaps. Villagers rushed to the hospital, many with respiratory issues, and told of how they heard a bang and moments later, they or their family members or friends collapsed. People reported smelling gas or rotten eggs before losing consciousness. Some of the survivors had passed out and remained that way for hours before finally recovering. Some of the lucky few. Those less fortunate had struggled for breath in their final moments, their lungs attacked by some unseen agent. In the days and weeks that followed the incident, investigators used these bits of information to try and piece together just what had happened at Lake Nyos that night. Somehow, a large amount of an unknown gas descended on these villages and suffocated all life on the ground. But where could it have come from? The area was once alive with volcanic activity, but has long been dormant, and there was no seismic activity detected in the area that night. They then turned their attention to the lake itself. Vegetation around the lake had been heavily disturbed, and the lake, normally a brilliant blue, was now a muddy red color. Something big had obviously happened here, something to bring all that iron-rich sediment from the bottom of the deep lake to the surface. And when they started to study water samples from the lake, they got a pretty good idea just what that was. Lake Nyos was saturated with carbon dioxide, and the deeper they took samples, the more saturated it became. Below 600 feet, the water was so saturated with CO2 that it became clear just what the problem was. For decades, that gas had laid dormant at the bottom of the lake, the pressure slowly building. Eventually, the deep waters were so saturated with the gas that all it took was a little push to disturb the delicate balance of pressures and allow it to be released. And with that pressure from below so high, the result was fast, and it was violent. It's like when you shake up a bottle of champagne and then open it. All of that CO2 is stirred up and immediately tries to escape. The pressure can build so much that it shoots the cork into the air, releasing the bubbly contents and the gas everywhere. Now, this is not a common thing to happen with lakes. In fact, it's extremely rare and the result of a combination of very particular circumstances. Lake Nyos is what's called a meromictic lake, and these types of lakes, due in large part to their extreme depth and steep sides, as well as a few other factors, don't mix throughout the year like other lakes do. Most lakes turn over at least once a year, allowing deep waters and shallow waters to mix and keep the lake relatively homogeneous. Meromictic lakes, because they do not mix, take on very different biological properties. The sediments that collect on the bottom are never disturbed, and the temperature difference from top to bottom can be vast. But overall, there is nothing dangerous about these lakes. It's when you add back in the fact that Lake Nyos sits on a now extinct volcanic field that you get trouble. Deep in the earth, below the lake, is a large magma chamber. This magma releases, along with other gases, carbon dioxide. This CO2 then works its way up through the rocks below the lake and eventually into the water itself. Normally, this gas would bubble its way to the surface from time to time and be released. But because of how deep this lake is, and the fact that it never mixes, the gas gets held down, trapped. The pressure of the water is actually so great that the gas dissolves into it. And over time, those deep lake waters become supersaturated with the CO2 gas. Now it's important to remember, the gas does not want to be there. It does not want to be in solution with the water, and it does not want to be trapped under the water. It is a gas, and gases want to expand. So back to Lake Nyos. When something disturbed the deep waters of the lake just enough, some of that gas came out of solution in the water. That in turn disturbed the water around the escaping gas, and more gas came out of solution. It was a chain reaction, and happened so rapidly that soon nearly all of this gas was racing up to the lake's surface, and when it got there, it rocketed into the air. The gas carried water up like a fountain, shooting as high as 300 feet. The reaction also likely caused a tsunami wave 80 feet tall to go rushing towards the lake shore. All this in a matter of about 20 seconds. As the waters pummeled the shore, the enormous cloud of carbon dioxide released from the lake began to descend on the surrounding area. And this is where the troubles really started. It's estimated that between 1 and 300,000 tons of CO2 were released into the air. And being heavier than oxygen, it quickly sank to the surface, displacing all breathable air. And it happened very, very fast. Those in low-lying areas suffered the worst of it. One woman recalled a great wind rushing through her family's compound of huts, causing her to immediately pass out. Hours later, she was the only one of her 30-plus family members, including her 4 children, to wake up. It was a terrible tragedy, a freak accident. And while the factors that had to come together to make it even possible are very rare, they are not unique. In fact, a similar event occurred just 60 miles away at Lake Manoon, and it actually happened 2 years before that disastrous day at Lake Nyos. It was August of 1984 when Lake Manoon exploded, known as a limnic eruption. The event was much smaller, but still 17 people were killed from the gas that erupted from the lake. They didn't fully understand what happened until it occurred 2 years later at Lake Nyos. After that, a lot of research was done on those lakes, and they realized something terrible. It could happen again. In the years immediately after the explosions, both lakes were already returning to dangerous levels of CO2 saturation. Something had to be done about it. They had to find a way to release some of the gas from the deep waters to prevent the buildup. And through science and engineering, they did. It's a process appropriately called degassing, and it works by using essentially a giant straw to siphon the saturated water to the top of the lake. Once it was started and the stream of CO2 and water came shooting out, about 150 feet into the air, the process was self-sustaining. Now each year, the amount of gas released is enough to not only balance the amount entering the water, but even reduce the level currently there. Though Lake Nyos is on the right track, they are not out of the woods yet. The chances of another limnic eruption, like the one that happened in 1986, have been reduced, but a big enough catalyst could still set it off again. And what about other lakes? Others like Lake Nyos and Lake Manoon? Well, there's currently only one other known lake in the world with a risk of a similar type of event. That is Lake Kivu, on the border of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. It is a lake much deeper and nearly 2,000 times larger than Lake Nyos. There is also evidence that eruptions have occurred there periodically throughout its history. But, unlike Lake Nyos, which had roughly 4,000 inhabitants nearby when it exploded, the area around Lake Kivu is home to about 2 million people. This episode was written by me, Corey Greiner. Keepsake is produced and edited by Alex Holscher. If you have an idea you'd like us to explore on the show, send us an email at keepsakepod@gmail.com. If you want to hear more episodes, make sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. This is an independently produced podcast, and reviews are the best way for us to gain more listeners, which in turn will help us to produce more episodes. And finally, next episode's item, a film slate. This has been Keepsake. Thanks for listening.